Israeli occupation army launches new wave of intense airstrikes across Gaza, targeting Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu defends renewed airstrikes on Gaza, insists ceasefire talks will continue only under fire. And the Russian President Putin agrees to halt attacks on energy infrastructure for 30 days, following a proposal from the US President Trump. And it's 10 a.m. Cairo local time, and you're watching Qnews, and I'm Salma Al-Fi'i. We begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Gaza. The Israeli occupation army has launched a new wave of intense airstrikes across northern, eastern and southern Gaza, targeting areas including Gaza City and Khan Yunis. The latest strikes came just a day after similar attacks on the region. Yesterday's airstrikes took place amid indirect negotiations between Israel and Hamas over a possible truce, which could include ending the war and the release of the remaining Israeli detainees. The attacks shattered nearly 2 months of ceasefire, raising fears of fully reigniting the 17-month conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has defended the renewed airstrikes on Gaza, stating that ceasefire negotiations will continue only under fire. Netanyahu stressed that military pressure on Hamas is a critical condition for securing the release of Israeli detainees, declaring this is just the beginning. He added that the strikes were ordered after Hamas rejected proposals to extend the ceasefire and vowed to intensify military operations. Israeli airstrikes and evacuation orders have forcibly displaced Palestinian families from Beit Hanun in northern Gaza. Airstrikes targeted homes and tent encampments across multiple locations from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks launched shelling from across the border, intensifying the situation on the ground. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in an anti-government protest following the decision to resume attacks on Gaza. The demonstration began with a rally followed by a march towards the Army and Defense Ministry headquarters. Protesters criticized Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for ordering the strikes after Hamas rejected proposals to extend the ceasefire. Freed Hamas detainees have called for an end to the war and the urgent return of 59 remaining detainees. And one of the detainees urged international mediators to exert maximum pressure on Hamas, warning time is running out and Israel must act now. Israel and Hamas blamed each other for violating the truce, which had largely held since January, providing temporary relief to Gaza's 2.3 million residents amid widespread destruction.
For 484 days, I was held in inhumane.
An acting U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has stated that responsibility for the resumption of hostilities in Gaza lies solely with Hamas, and the United States supports Israel in its next steps. Dorothy Shea made the statement to a United Nations Security Council briefing. Shea said U.S. President Donald Trump had made clear that Hamas must release the detainees it is holding immediately or pay a high price.
Has steadfastly refused.
And the European Union has urged Israel to halt its bombing of Gaza and allow unrestricted humanitarian aid into the territory. The EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, along with Commissioners Dubravka Shuaisa and Haja Labib, called on Israel to adhere to international humanitarian law, end military aggression, and restore the flow of aid and electricity to Gaza. They reaffirmed the EU stance that negotiations are the only path forward, stressing that stability is essential for reconstruction efforts. A World Health Organization representative has warned that Israeli airstrikes are worsening Gaza's already critical shortage of medical supplies. WHO's representative in the occupied Palestinian territory, Richard Pieperkorn, highlighted the dwindling availability of essential treatments for chronic diseases and surgical procedures. He stressed that since March the 2nd, the blockade on humanitarian and commercial supplies has severely impacted Gaza and called for its immediate lifting to ensure the delivery of life-saving aid.
That the entry of all humanitarian commercial supplies into Gaza.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has reaffirmed the United Nations' role in pushing for a ceasefire, humanitarian access, and the release of detainees in Gaza. Speaking in Geneva, Guterres stressed that the UN will not abandon these efforts. He condemned the intolerable suffering of the Palestinian people, highlighting the ongoing airstrikes that have killed hundreds and the continued blockage of humanitarian aid.
That the role of the UN is to do everything.
The UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator has called for an end to hostilities in Gaza and the immediate entry of humanitarian and commercial supplies into the territory. UN Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher warned that since March the 2nd, Israeli authorities have blocked all life-saving supplies, including food, medicine, fuel, and cooking gas for Gaza's 2.1 million residents. He also noted that the UN requests to collect aid stranded at the Karm Abu Salim crossing have been denied. Fletcher emphasized that the recent ceasefire demonstrated what was possible and allowed for the delivery of much-needed aid. The UN Human Rights Office has accused Israel of expanding and consolidating settlements in the occupied West Bank in violation of international law. Head of the UN Human Rights Office for the occupied Palestinian territory, Ajit Sangai, warned that settlement expansion is accelerating at an alarming rate. He also highlighted the widespread forced displacement of Palestinians, further worsening the situation on the ground.
In the West Bank, settlements are expanding at an alarming rate.
Palestinians in Gaza have voiced frustration at the United States' support for Israel following deadly Israeli airstrikes which brought the ceasefire to the brink. In Washington, a White House spokesperson said Israel had consulted the U.S. administration before it carried out the strikes. With the backing of the United States, Israel had been pressing for the return of the remaining detainees in exchange for a longer-term truce to halt fighting. And at least 10 U.S. strikes have targeted areas in Yemen, including the capital, Sana'a. The U.S. strikes against the Houthis were launched last Saturday, March the 15th, and are the biggest U.S. military operation in the Middle East since President Donald Trump took office in January. The Houthis said they had launched scores of attacks on shipping after Israel's war with Hamas began in late 2023, saying they were acting in solidarity with Gaza's Palestinians. And the leader of Yemen's Houthi movement, Abdel Malik al-Houthi, has announced that his group will escalate actions against Israel in response to its continued assault on the Gaza Strip. And al-Houthi vowed to take all possible measures against Israel and pledged unwavering support for the Palestinian cause. Yesterday, Israeli airstrikes on Gaza killed more than 400 people, according to the Palestinian health authorities, marking the deadliest escalation in weeks after ceasefire negotiations collapsed. Yemen's Houthis have said they would expand their range of targets in Israel in the next hours and days unless the aggression on Gaza stops. Military spokesperson Yahya Sarriya also confirmed that they had targeted an air base in Israel with a ballistic missile. Earlier, the Israeli military said it had intercepted a missile launched from Yemen towards Israeli territory. Sirens sounded in several areas of Israel. Move to the latest developments in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has expressed support for a U.S. proposal to halt strikes on the Russian energy infrastructure and said he hopes to speak with the U.S. President Donald Trump about his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Following the Trump-Putin conversation, Zelensky held talks with the French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, key European allies. He also emphasized the importance of continued military aid to Ukraine, urging Kiev's partners not to scale back their support. Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to a proposal by the U.S. President Donald Trump for a 30-day halt on attacks against energy infrastructure in Russia and Ukraine, issuing corresponding orders to the Russian military. The Kremlin stated that the two leaders had a detailed and frank exchange of views on Ukraine during a phone call. Putin emphasized that any resolution to the conflict must be comprehensive, sustainable, and long-term, considering Russia's security interests and the root causes of the war. The discussion also covered the U.S. proposal 30-day ceasefire, which Ukraine had already accepted last week. The Kremlin noted that Putin raised concerns about monitoring the truce and preventing Ukraine from using it to mobilize troops and rearm. U.S. President Donald Trump has stated that aid to Ukraine was not discussed in his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin mentioned that the Russian leader had called for an end to military assistance for Kiev. The Kremlin added that after the Trump-Putin call, that Putin also emphasized that any resolution of the conflict would require an end to all military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine.
Among my very highest priorities is to rescue our economy and get dramatic and immediate.
Germany's outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called a ceasefire on attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure an important first step, but said a total ceasefire must be next. Speaking at a news conference in Berlin with French President Emmanuel Macron, Scholz reiterated that there must be no decision without Ukraine and above Ukraine's head. Putin and Trump agreed to a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, limited to energy infrastructure, at a time when Washington was trying to convince Moscow to accept a comprehensive truce. And U.S. President Donald Trump has released material related to the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, seeking to honor his campaign promise to provide more transparency about the shock event in Texas. Trump signed an order shortly after taking office in January related to the release, prompting the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation to find thousands of new documents related to the Kennedy assassination in Dallas. A federal judge has blocked billionaire Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency from taking any more steps to shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development, saying their efforts to close the agency violated the U.S. Constitution. And in a preliminary ruling, U.S. District Judge Theodore Schwang in Maryland ordered President Donald Trump's advisor Musk and Doge to restore access to U.S. aid for the agency direct and contract employees, including thousands who have been placed on leave. The ruling came in response to a lawsuit by current and former employees, one of the several currently pending over the rapid dismantling of the foreign aid agency. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has stated that Europe must rearm by 2030. Von der Leyen highlighted that Readiness 2030 means to have rearmed and developed the capabilities to have credible deterrence and a defense industrial base that is strategic advantage. She added, to be 2030 ready, the Union must move now. Von der Leyen also told Greenland and Denmark that the EU would always support sovereignty and territorial integrity, responding to U.S. President Donald Trump's designs on the Arctic island.
And now Russia is on an irreversible path.
And now we move on to Henny Saif in our newsroom. Good morning, Henny.
Good morning, Selma. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for the economic and financial updates happening from all around the world, so stay tuned. The Bank of Japan has kept interest rates steady in a widely expected move. The decision came as fears of a global slowdown caused by U.S. President wage and price data showing Japan making progress in durably achieving the bank's 2% inflation target. The central bank said rising rice costs would push up inflation at home, while trade policies of other countries cast doubts over Japan's economic outlook. Germany's outgoing parliament has passed a massive increase in government borrowing, including a sweeping change to the country's debt rules. Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz's Conservatives and the Social Democrats proposed a €500 billion fund for infrastructure and defense, adjusting borrowing rules to boost Germany's economy. To secure a two-thirds parliamentary majority, they incorporated last-minute Green Party demands. The Bundesrat upper house will vote on the legislation on Friday. French President Emmanuel Macron has welcomed the approval by the German parliament of plans for a massive spending surge. Macron mentioned that the approval by the German parliament of plans for a massive spending surge in hopes of reviving economic growth and scaling up military spending for a new era of European collective defense is excellent news. Outgoing German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that with the decision, the German Bundestag had paved the way for Germany to live up to its responsibility. Monsieur le Chancelier a rendu compte des échanges. Britain's Labour government has announced plans to cut more than £5 billion from its welfare budget by 2030. The cuts are a prelude to a March 26th which is said to be the moment when pre-election promises to limit tax rises and tightly control borrowing meet the reality of lower than expected growth and tax revenues and a worsening global economic backdrop. British ministers see welfare reform as an opportunity to cut costs while boosting the economy by getting more people into work.
Spending on working age sickness and disability benefits up 20 billion since the pandemic.
Kazakhstan has announced its energy minister will stand down from his role as the government struggles to convince US and European oil companies to lower production that exceeds OPEC+ targets. According to a presidential decree, Almasadam Satkiliev will become the head of the country's newly created Atomic Energy Agency. However, it remains unclear who will succeed him at the Energy Ministry. President Vladimir Putin has told Russian business leaders not to count on fully free trade or movement of capital being restored in the event of Western sanctions on Russia being eased. Putin told a meeting with Russian businessmen their competitors will always want to weaken and contain them. Putin also said that Western companies that slammed the door defiantly when they left Russia will not be allowed to buy back the businesses they quit for small amounts of money or fill niches that local businesses have taken.
Санкции – это не временные или точечные меры.
These are all the economic news we have for now. Now we move back to Selma in the studio. Selma.
Thank you, Hani. And that brings us to the end of our news bulletin, and here's what we've been covering. Israeli occupation army launches new wave of intense airstrikes across Gaza, targeting Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu defends renewed airstrikes on Gaza, insists ceasefire talks will continue only under fire. And Russian President Putin agrees to halt attacks on energy infrastructure for 30 days, following a proposal from the US President Trump. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour, and don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEG to stay informed. And thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Q News.